But not just in Africa, in other parts of the world too. Here in Australia, I've had the great opportunity to travel with Aboriginal people. They've been incredible teachers to me. I've actually spent more time in Australia in the company of Aboriginals than I have in modern Australians. I have a more Aboriginal outlook on the Australian bush than a Western one. That is because they taught me that, and it's a real privilege to do so, and very interesting. The first community I went to work with was a tiny community right in the top of Australia, in an area that you can only go into with Aboriginal permission. Here I worked with an extended family, 14 people, for a period of a month making a documentary. In those days we would spend a month making a half-hour documentary. Today an hour-long documentary may be made in 15 days, so there's been a big change in television in that time. A few years later, I found myself here in the central deserts of Australia working with a completely different Aboriginal tribe, a different language, a different people. But somehow they could tell that I'd worked with Aboriginals before, maybe in the way I communicated with them. I remember one of the old men there, he said to me, "You work with Aboriginal people before?" I said, "Yeah." "Where was that?" And I thought, well, I'll tell him, but I mean, it's 1,000 miles away. And I said, "Well, this tiny little community in Arnhem Land." He says, yeah. "What's the name of the outstation?" And I told him the name of the place. And he said, "There's an old man there, George. You know him?" How do they know? And I started to realise that these cultures that I'm dealing with have complexities that are very subtle and very deep-rooted and very real and very, very different to our own. It's a mind-broadening experience to work with people like this. And you have to accept what you're encountering. And once you accept it, you step for a moment into their world. And the longer you step into their world, the more they share with you. Very subtly, you're being judged minute by minute, day by day, hour by hour. And it's very special. This is a very old man, and very interesting man, and he was my first Aboriginal teacher, if you like. Interesting, he speared 4 Japanese soldiers during the Second World War. There was a lot of people don't realise that there were Japanese soldiers on Australian soil during the Second World War. A lot of the stories were suppressed to prevent damage to the morale that would want Australian soldiers petitioning to come back to fight in Australia. In the late 1930s, Japanese fishermen went to northern Australia to collect sea slugs. So they got to know the area very well. In fact, they upset the local Aboriginal population, and there was a small war broke out. And so an anthropologist called Donald Thompson was sent up there with the job of stopping this war. And he said, those yellow men, you don't spear them anymore. "Okay, boss." Well, when the Second World War broke out, he got sent back up there. You're ahead of me. "Okay, boss." And these men patrolled the northern shore of Australia. Very interesting. Here he is making fire, and he was in his 80s, and he was struggling to make fire because of his age, because of the energy involved, and because he couldn't get to the wood he wanted to use because of the crocodiles. There was still flood water, and where the wood grew that he wanted to use, he couldn't get to it because of the saltwater crocodiles, which are very dangerous in this part of Australia. It was wonderful working alongside him. I learned many things. But to come back to our environmental theme, one of my strongest memories of visiting my first Aboriginal village was of encountering scenes like this, modern Aboriginal people using white flour, using tinned meat, corned beef, things of this nature, sardines. And it didn't strike me as anything odd at all, but the director who came with me to make that film, he turned to me and he said, "This place is filthy." He says, "There's rubbish everywhere." And I stopped and I hadn't noticed it because I was too interested in everything else that was going on. Then I thought about it. He was right. There was rubbish everywhere. One of the things that is really interesting about working with First Nation people is I have to discern whether the people I'm working with are still living their traditional lifestyle. And where I look for information on that is in the rubbish that surrounds their camps. If I go to a Bushman camp, I want to see, are there the remains of wild fruits? Is there the core from a Makalani palm, or the shells from a ongongo fruit? Are these things lying around the camp? Are they still collecting bush meat? Because they eat the food, they take the rubbish, and like old Henry VIII, they throw it over their shoulder. Of course, Aboriginal people were doing the same with white man's food. Tin can over the shoulder. The difference is, it didn't rot away. Hence the rubbish. And then I thought some more. Is there any difference between them and us? Surely the only difference is that we pay somebody to collect it and take it where we don't have to look at it. For certainly we are still creating the same amount of rubbish, if not much more than they do today. Rubbish is interesting. It's actually the rubbish left by our ancestors that enables us to understand them. The hand axe, the stone tool, was once a universal tool used by our kind all around the planet. We know from remarkable archaeological sites, well, one particular remarkable site in Britain, at a place called Box Grove, that when our Paleolithic ancestors cut up an animal, they would make a new hand axe like this to cut the animal up. The tool was less important than the meat, and they would often leave them behind so that they could carry the meat away. So these things were left as rubbish, and of course the flint is one of the most enduring substances known to humankind, was sitting there for us to discover thousands and thousands of years later.